For tonight's devotional, I want to take us to yet another miracle on the other side of the Sermon on the Mount. Last week we looked at Jesus healing a leper and some lessons we could learn from that. But I want to move on from here. All throughout the Gospel of Matthew, there's this constant refrain reminding us that Jesus is the long-awaited and prophesied King from the Hebrew Bible. And so if you look in a passage like Matthew 12:23, where they're asking the question, could this be, in fact, the Son of David? And Matthew's answer is yes, absolutely. And one of the ways to show that that's absolutely the case is some of these healings. Last week we looked at as Jesus reached out to the most marginalized, outcast human being in his day, and that was the leper. In the words of Chrysostom, to the pure, nothing is impure. And so we saw the gospel in the grasp of Jesus. He didn't have to touch the man. In fact, it would have made him ceremonially unclean, but he cannot be made unclean because of who he is within his own person. But now we move on from that, and there's a second miracle discussed in chapter 8, beginning in verse 5 down through verse 13, where Jesus encounters, of all people, a Gentile. Also somebody who's not a part of the inner circle of the life of faith of the people of God. And in particular, this Gentile's interesting because he's a centurion. So as we look in verse 5, when Jesus came into Capernaum, a centurion came up to him and he was begging him. Already this picture is unreal. A centurion, just from the word centurion, we hear the word century. This is a man in charge of 100 soldiers. That's an astonishing thing to think about his own importance, his own power. He was a person who was barred also from anything having to do with Israel's inner life of faith. He was a Gentile, a Syrian. Lepers, we just looked at last week, they could not enter the city at all. Gentiles could only enter into the outermost court of the Gentiles of the temple, if they were converts perhaps, but only a leper was to be seen as more unclean. If you look in verse 6, he's begging Jesus. This is astonishing by itself, but he's begging Jesus, Lord, my son or my servant, depending on your translation, is in terrible pain. The centurion, like the leper, addresses Jesus as Lord. Also like the leper, he doesn't ask him to do anything. He just makes a statement, just stating fact, with this expectation that Jesus could help. Now, Matthew uses this word pace in Greek a few times in his own gospel with the meaning of son. It can have the meaning, without getting lost in the weeds, it can have the meaning either of servant or son. It could be that he had a servant that he looked at as a son. But if you look at verse 7, he makes this emphatic statement, Jesus does, where he says, I'm coming to heal him. Let me go to heal him. And this is, I think, grace on display in the person of Jesus. He's eager to help this man that really he has, at least in the mindset of ancient Israel, he would normally not have the mindset or eagerness to help. But remember who he is. He is Emmanuel. He is God with us. And so notice verse 8, the centurion said to him, Lord, I'm not worthy for you to come under my roof. And the irony here is that by thinking himself unworthy for Jesus to enter into his house, he actually becomes worthy. But notice what he says. He says, you don't have to come into my house. Only say the word. But only say the word and it'll happen. Here's the centurion's humility in front of this man who's among the people that his own army has conquered. Now, this is what makes this whole thing unbelievable, because he comes to this man from this conquered nation his own army has conquered and is now occupying his homeland, and he's begging him for healing for somebody that he values deeply and loves. And what we see next in verse 10, when Jesus heard this, he marveled and said to those who followed, "Assuredly I say to you, I have not found such a great faith even in Israel." That's astonishing. This is the first explicit mention of faith in the entire New Testament. And it's about a Gentile, an outcast, a member of the conquering army that now occupies the land, the ancestral homeland of the people of God. And what follows is he says, "I say to you, many will come from the east and the west and sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, but the sons of the kingdom will be cast out into outer darkness, and there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." You know, when you look at that verse 12, outer darkness, weeping and gnashing of teeth, nobody speaks more frequently about hell than Jesus. There's really powerful warnings from the lips of Jesus. Love warns. And so he's serving us in doing this. But what's interesting is that Jesus' warnings about hell always occur in messages to people who already believe that they're going to heaven. Jesus doesn't preach hell to pagans in the gospel accounts. He preaches it to people who already think they're a shoo-in to be in the presence of God. And so Jesus didn't use hell to preach it to pagans on street corners. He used it to correct people who thought themselves to be faithful, but they were not. And I think it's impossible to preach about the kingdom of heaven without having any real convictions about the reality of hell. And so Jesus here has much to say to this centurion. He makes sure that the healing happens. He blesses this man in this way. He honors his faith. And it's interesting to note that the centurion's faith becomes the channel through which Jesus chooses to heal. And I want to just liken that to our own rescue and salvation. The truth of the matter is, your faith is the channel through which Jesus brings the forgiveness of sins, ultimate healing. And so what's the status of your faith? I pray one day that Jesus can magnify our own faith as if he had not seen it anywhere before us. What would it take for me and for you to build our faith so that Jesus would praise it?
We gather here in Jesus' name. His love is burning in our hearts like living flame. For through the loving Son, the Father makes us one. Come take the bread, come drink